A soldier's loyal dog waited outside the hospital for days. What happened next left everyone speechless. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stepped off the bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The familiar streets of his hometown stretched out before him, but they felt foreign after years spent in the deserts of the Middle East. By his side, Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, surveyed their surroundings with alert eyes. They had been through hell together, Daniel and Ranger. IED blasts, firefights, the screams of the wounded and dying, they had witnessed it all side by side. And now, after 3 tours spread across 8 long years, they were finally home. But as Daniel began the walk to his childhood home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he no longer belonged here. The quaint houses and manicured lawns seemed like they were from another life. The war still raged in his mind. How could he just slip back into his old routines? His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket for his keys. Ranger sat attentively by his side, seeming to sense his growing unease. With a steadying breath, Daniel unlocked the door and crossed the threshold. "We're home, buddy," he said softly to Ranger. The dog's tail thumped once against the hardwood floor in response. But as Daniel looked around at the dust-covered furniture and faded photographs on the walls, he wasn't so sure. Home didn't quite feel like home anymore. The first few weeks passed in a blur of restless sleep, cold sweats, and the occasional trip to the VA for appointments. Daniel tried to establish a routine, rising early for runs with Ranger, forcing himself to eat 3 square meals a day. But the nagging sense that he was simply going through the motions persisted. Ranger was his one constant, the only thread tying him to his old life and simultaneously anchoring him in the present. The dog's unconditional love and steady presence were often the only things that got Daniel out of bed in the morning. It was on one of their early morning runs that Daniel first encountered Richard Langley. He and Ranger rounded a corner near the town square and nearly collided with the councilman as he stepped out of his shiny BMW. "Watch it!" Langley snapped, glaring at Daniel and Ranger with disdain. His gaze flicked down to Daniel's prosthetic leg, peeking out from the hem of his shorts. "You're one of those wounded vets, aren't you? The town already does more than enough for your kind." Daniel was taken aback by the naked contempt in Langley's voice. He mumbled an apology and hurried past, Ranger trotting loyally at his heels. The interaction left a sour taste in his mouth. He had fought and bled for his country, sacrificed his youth and his health, and this was the thanks he got. Still, Daniel tried to push the encounter from his mind as he and Ranger looped back home. There would always be men like Langley, he told himself. Men who measured others solely by what they could do for them. All he could do was keep his head down and focus on his own path forward, no matter how uncertain that path might be. In the months that followed, Daniel slowly carved out a quiet existence for himself and Ranger. He picked up odd jobs here and there, just enough to supplement his military pension and keep them afloat. In the evenings, he tinkered with an old motorcycle in the garage, finding some small measure of peace in the methodical work of bringing the machine back to life. But Daniel's wounds ran deeper than the scars on his body. Sleep remained elusive, and when it did come, it was often disturbed by nightmares of blood and smoke and fallen friends. He knew he should reach out, should talk to someone. But the words always seemed to stick in his throat. Only Ranger was privy to the depths of his pain. On the nights when Daniel woke up shouting, his sheets soaked in sweat, the dog was always there, ready to put his head under Daniel's palm or rest his solid weight against Daniel's leg until the worst of the shaking subsided. It was Ranger who ultimately pushed Daniel to rejoin the world. They were out on one of their customary walks, cutting through a park near the center of town, when a frisbee landed at Daniel's feet. A young girl came rushing over, pigtails flying behind her. "Sorry, mister," she chirped, scooping up the toy. Then her eyes lighted on Ranger. "Can I pet your dog?" For a moment, Daniel hesitated, unsure. But Ranger was already stepping forward, his tail wagging. The girl giggled as she ruffled his ears, proclaiming him the best dog she'd ever met. Something about the innocent joy in her voice made Daniel's next words come easier. "You know, I bet Ranger would love to play fetch with you for a bit." If that's okay with your folks. The girl beamed up at him before scampering off to get permission. As Daniel watched Ranger chase after the frisbee a few minutes later, he felt the tight knot in his chest loosen, just a little. Maybe there was still a place for them here after all. But the shadows of the past were never far behind. One evening, a loud bang from a car backfiring sent Daniel diving for cover behind a dumpster, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ranger pressed close beside him, whining softly. It took nearly an hour for the panic to subside, for Daniel to convince himself that he was safe, that the war was thousands of miles away. He staggered home in a daze, shame and frustration burning in his gut. He couldn't go on like this, jumping at every loud noise, reliving the worst moments of his life in vivid technicolor. He needed help, real help. And so, with shaking hands, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for the VA mental health clinic. It was the hardest call Daniel had ever made. But as he sat on the couch afterwards, Ranger's head resting in his lap, he felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. He had taken the first step. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Life slowly started to regain a sense of normalcy. With therapy and medication, the nightmares came less often, the flashbacks less intense. Daniel started volunteering at the local animal shelter, finding solace in caring for creatures who had also known hardship. But the specter of Richard Langley still loomed over the town. Development signs bearing his name sprang up on every corner, often accompanied by increases in rent that forced longtime residents out of their homes. Daniel's jaw would clench every time he saw that smug face smiling down from a billboard or campaign poster. The boiling point came on a sweltering August afternoon. Daniel was walking Ranger home from the shelter when he heard raised voices coming from a small house up ahead. A young man sat on the front steps, head in his hands, while a woman sobbed into her apron beside him. Two small children clung to her skirts, their eyes wide and uncertain. And standing over them, flanked by two burly men in ill-fitting suits, was Richard Langley himself. "I've told you before, you're behind on your payments," Langley was saying, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The bank is foreclosing, simple as that. You have until the end of the week to vacate the premises." "Please," the young man said, his voice cracking. "I just need a little more time. Since I got back from Afghanistan, it hasn't been easy, but I swear I'll get the money. You've had more than enough time." Langley cut him off with a wave of his hand. "This property is part of our new urban redevelopment initiative. We can't let one delinquent homeowner hold up progress for everyone, now can we?" Daniel's blood boiled as he took in the man's military haircut, the dog tags hanging around his neck. This was a veteran, someone who had served just as he had, and Langley was throwing him and his family out on the street like trash. Before he knew what he was doing, Daniel was striding forward, Ranger close at his heels. "What seems to be the problem here, Councilman?" he asked, placing himself between Langley and the family. Langley's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you. Run along and mind your own business." "But it is my business," Daniel replied evenly. "This man is a veteran, like me. Surely the town can work out a payment plan and find some way to help him get back on his feet." Langley barked out a harsh laugh. "You think service grants you special privileges? The world doesn't work that way. If you can't pay, you can't stay, simple as that." Daniel's hands balled into fists at his sides. Ranger let out a low, warning growl, his hackles rising. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared each other down. Then Langley's gaze flicked to the cell phone poking out of Daniel's breast pocket, and a slow, sly smile spread across his face. "On second thought, perhaps we can make an exception in this case," he said smoothly. "We wouldn't want to seem unsupportive of our brave servicemen, after all." He snapped his fingers at his henchmen. "Let them stay, for now. I have a feeling we won't be hearing any more objections from this quarter." With that, he turned on his heel and strode away. Daniel remained rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. He had won this small battle, but he knew, with sinking certainty, that he had just made a very dangerous enemy. The attack came 2 nights later. Daniel was walking Ranger in the park, his mind preoccupied with worry over how he was going to pay his own bills that month, when three shadowy figures stepped out from behind a copse of trees. "That was a real stupid move, sticking your nose in the councilman's business," one of them growled. Daniel barely had time to register the lead pipe in the man's hand before it was swinging towards his head. He lurched aside, feeling the rush of air as it whooshed past his ear. Then Ranger was there, 80 pounds of furious teeth and fur, launching himself at the attacker with a snarl. The man screamed as the dog's jaws clamped down on his arm, the pipe clattering to the ground. But the other two were on Daniel in an instant, kicking and punching, driving the breath from his lungs. A boot caught him hard in his bad leg and he crumpled, pain shooting up his spine. Through the haze of agony, he heard Ranger yelp and saw the dog stagger back from a vicious kick to the ribs. Rage overtook him then, and he surged back to his feet, ignoring the white-hot protest of his injuries. What happened next was a blur. Fists and feet flew, bones crunched. At some point Daniel's hands closed around the fallen pipe. He swung with all his strength, felt the jarring impact as it connected with flesh and bone. An eternity later, it was over. The three attackers lay groaning and still on the grass. Daniel swayed where he stood, Ranger leaning heavily against his leg. His last thought before he slipped into unconsciousness was that he needed to get to Ranger, needed to make sure his loyal friend was all right. Daniel awoke to blinding white lights and the steady beep of a heart monitor. He tried to sit up, only to fall back with a gasp as pain lanced through his temples. Memories came back in jagged pieces. The park. The ambush. Ranger. He jolted upright, ignoring the wave of dizziness that crashed over him. "Where's my dog?" he demanded of the nurse that came rushing in at the sound of his agitated monitors. "Sir, you need to stay calm," she said, gently but firmly pressing him back against the pillows. "You've suffered a severe concussion and several cracked ribs." "Ranger," Daniel repeated urgently. "Is he okay? Where is he?" The nurse's eyes softened. "Your dog is being cared for, I promise. But right now we need to focus on you." Over the next few hours, the story came out in bits and pieces. A jogger had found Daniel unconscious in the park and called 911. Ranger had been standing guard over him, bloodied and limping, but refusing to leave his side. The dog had been taken to the vet for treatment. But every day since, he had stationed himself outside the hospital doors, waiting from sunup to sundown for Daniel to emerge. The nurses had started bringing him food and water on their breaks, touched by his unwavering loyalty. Tears pricked at the corners of Daniel's eyes as he listened. Even battered and bruised, Ranger's first instinct had been to protect him, to stay with him. He didn't know what he had done to deserve such devotion, but he silently vowed to spend the rest of his days striving to be worthy of it. Daniel's injuries kept him in the hospital for nearly a week. The police came to take his statement, but with no witnesses and Daniel's understandably hazy memory, there was little they could do. Daniel didn't push the issue. He knew exactly who was behind the attack, but he also knew that men like Richard Langley rarely faced consequences. Ranger's vigil did not go unnoticed. Nurses and patients alike would pause to watch the dog through the lobby windows, marveling at his patience. Children would beg their parents to let them bring him treats. Slowly, his story began to spread. It started with a post on the hospital's Facebook page, a candid shot of Ranger resting on the sidewalk, ears pricked towards the door. The caption spoke of the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his faithful companion. Within hours, the post had thousands of likes and shares. The local news picked it up next. They ran a human interest piece on the evening broadcast, interviewing the jogger who had found Daniel and the nurses who had been caring for Ranger. Suddenly, the whole town was talking about the wounded veteran and his loyal dog. Daniel watched it all from his hospital bed with a growing sense of unease. He had never wanted attention, never sought the spotlight. All he had wanted was to serve his country and come home to a quiet life. But now it seemed that choice had been taken from him. The unease blossomed into full-blown anxiety when a nurse informed him that the mayor and several town councilmen would be visiting the hospital for a photo op with him and Ranger. Absolutely not, Daniel said flatly. The last thing he wanted was to shake hands with Richard Langley and pretend all was forgiven. But the nurse frowned. I don't think you understand. This isn't a request. The director of the hospital has already agreed. Daniel's stomach turned at the thought. But what could he do? He was in no position to risk the hospital's ire, not when he was relying on their care to recover. Fine, he bit out. But I'm not saying a word to Langley, and neither is Ranger. The nurse looked confused. Councilman Langley won't be there. He's apparently had an urgent matter come up. It will just be the mayor and a few of your fellow veterans. Relief crashed over Daniel, followed immediately by suspicion. What urgent matter could have drawn Langley away from a perfect opportunity to bask in positive media attention? Whatever it was, Daniel had a feeling it didn't bode well for him. But for now, all he could do was paste on a smile and endure the forced celebration to come. He owed that much to Ranger, at least, for all the dog had done for him. The photo op was every bit as uncomfortable as Daniel had feared. Flashbulbs popped in his face as he shook hands with the mayor, struggling to keep a neutral expression as the man spouted empty platitudes about honoring veterans. The other former soldiers shifted awkwardly in their too stiff dress uniforms, clearly as ill at ease with the spectacle as Daniel was. Only Ranger seemed unperturbed, sitting calmly at Daniel's side in a handsome new vest emblazoned with the word hero. The hospital had gifted it to him for the occasion. Every so often he would bump his head against Daniel's hand or lean his solid weight into Daniel's good leg, offering silent support. After what felt like an eternity, the reporters and dignitaries finally left. Daniel sagged back against his pillows, exhausted and aching. He scratched Ranger behind the ears, murmuring soft words of praise and apology for the ordeal. But any peace they had found was short-lived. Not 10 minutes later, Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct told him to answer. Mr. Hayes. Richard Langley's voice was smooth as oiled silk. I saw your little media circus today. Very touching. Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing, waiting for the hammer to fall. It seems you've become quite the local celebrity, Langley continued blithely. A symbol of hope and resilience for our struggling veterans. It would be a real shame if anything happened to tarnish that shining reputation of yours. Rage and fear roared in Daniel's chest. What do you want, Langley? Want? Why, I simply want to ensure that our town's heroes are treated with the respect they deserve, Langley replied, mock sincerity dripping from every word. And that respect includes staying out of matters that don't concern them. Like, say, my real estate developments. Daniel's free hand clenched into a fist. So that's what this is about. You're still sore that I stopped you from throwing that veteran and his family out on the street. Langley's chuckle was devoid of humor. Consider it a friendly reminder to mind your own business moving forward. Your service may have earned you a scrap of goodwill from the public, but don't mistake their fickle adoration for actual power. One word from me, and that dog of yours will be put down as a public menace. Believe me, I can make it happen. Daniel went cold at the threat to Ranger. He forced himself to take a deep breath. I won't let you bully me into silence. The people of this town deserve better than to live under your thumb. The people of this town are happy to go about their lives and let their elected officials make the hard decisions. If you're smart, you'll follow their example. Think on that while you're enjoying all your accolades. And Daniel? I wouldn't get too attached to the spotlight. It has a way of turning on people like you. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Langley had effectively declared war, and the first shots had already been fired with the attack in the park. He knew he should be afraid, and part of him was. But another part, the part that had driven him to enlist all those years ago, thrummed with grim determination. Richard Langley wanted a fight? Fine. Daniel would give him one. But he would fight on his own terms, the right way, for all the struggling folks in town who were tired of one man ruling them through greed and fear. His gaze fell on Ranger. The dog met his eyes steadily, ever faithful, ready to follow him into whatever fray lay ahead. Together, they had survived worse than Richard Langley. And together, they would weather this storm as well. No matter what it took. Daniel was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. To his surprise and consternation, a small crowd had gathered to cheer for him and Ranger as they exited the building. He shook hands and nodded at the thanks and well wishes on autopilot, too overwhelmed to do more than offer token smiles before beating a hasty retreat. He escaped to the safety and solitude of his house as fast as his still-mending body would allow. But even there, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, of a target settling between his shoulder blades. Langley's threat hung over him like a dark cloud. For the first time, Daniel found himself wishing that his story hadn't spread, that his face hadn't ended up plastered all over the nightly news. He had just wanted to help one fellow vet, now he had accidentally positioned himself as the public face of resistance against the town's most powerful man. Worse, he knew his newfound notoriety wouldn't protect him, or Ranger, from any retribution Langley wanted to enact. If anything, it just made them bigger and more tempting targets. So Daniel did the only thing he could do, he laid low. He stopped his walks with Ranger, avoiding town as much as possible. He hated it, hated feeling like a prisoner in his own home, but what choice did he have? He couldn't put Ranger at more risk, not after everything the loyal dog had done for him. Ranger seemed to sense his mounting anxiety and rarely left his side in those first tense days, always watchful, always on guard. Having him close helped more than Daniel could express. Not for the first time, he marveled at the pure devotion and love a dog could hold for their person. He held onto that love like an anchor as the isolation began to wear on him. His therapist noted his increasing agitation during their sessions, but Daniel brushed off her concerns. How could he explain that it wasn't his PTSD acting up, but the very real threat of a man who essentially owned the town? Just when the walls felt like they were closing in for good, a knock sounded at his door. Daniel approached warily, Ranger at his heels, wondering if Langley had finally decided to dispense with the warnings and deal with him directly. But it was a reporter, her face earnest and hopeful as Daniel cracked open the door. "Mr. Hayes? I was hoping to get a statement from you on." "No comment," Daniel said curtly. He moved to close the door, but she wedged a well-heeled foot in the gap. "Wait, please. Just hear me out." She took a deep breath. "I think Councilman Langley is corrupt. I think he's been using his position to line his own pockets and strong-arm anyone who gets in his way. And I think you're the key to exposing him." Daniel stared at the reporter, trying to gauge her sincerity. She met his gaze squarely, her expression open and unwavering. Against his better judgment, he opened the door a little wider. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Pearson?" "Lena Pearson." She stuck out a hand and he shook it briefly. "I want to investigate Langley. I've been hearing rumors for years about his shady deals, but no one's been brave enough to go on the record. Until you." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just couldn't stand by and watch him bully that veteran. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did. And now people are finally paying attention." Lena leaned forward intently. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel, this is our chance to show the world who Richard Langley really is. To give a voice to everyone he's exploited or intimidated into silence. But I can't do it without you." Daniel hesitated, torn. Part of him wanted nothing more than to fade back into obscurity, to protect himself and Ranger from any further harm. But a larger part, the part that had driven him to stand up to Langley in the first place, couldn't ignore this opportunity to right the wrongs he had seen. As Daniel watched him run through drills, guiding around obstacles, providing grounding pressure during anxiety attacks, retrieving dropped items, he marveled at all that his incredible dog was capable of. All that they were capable of, together. A year to the day after Langley's arrest, Daniel and Ranger graduated from their training program. The whole town turned out to celebrate, cheering as they crossed the stage to receive Ranger's official service vest. Lena was there in the front row, snapping pictures and beaming with pride. Daniel's heart felt full to bursting as he looked out at all the faces smiling back at him, all the people who had rallied behind him when he needed it most. His gaze fell last on Ranger, sitting tall and proud at his side. In that moment, he knew with bone-deep certainty that everything they had been through, every hurt and struggle, had led them here. To this new beginning, this new purpose. Together, they had weathered the storm. And together, they would forge ahead into brighter days. 1 year later, the sun shone high and bright as Daniel climbed the steps of Town Hall, Ranger a reassuring presence at his heel. He took a moment at the top to smooth down his tie, a rare concession to the formality of the occasion. "You ready for this, buddy?" he murmured. Ranger chuffed softly and Daniel smiled, ruffling his ears. "Me neither. But we didn't come this far to chicken out now." He pushed open the heavy oak doors and strode in. A cheer went up as he entered the main chamber, the space packed to the rafters with familiar faces. At the podium, Mayor Santos beamed and beckoned him forward. "The man of the hour," she said warmly, shaking his hand. "And Ranger too, of course. Thank you both for being here today." Daniel shifted self-consciously as a smattering of applause ran through the crowd. Even after everything, he still wasn't quite used to being the center of attention. He cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you all for coming out." He looked around the room, taking in all the people who had become such an integral part of his life. His therapist, his VA group, his fellow dog trainers. Lena, poised with her pen over her ever-present notepad. The veteran he had defended from Langley, his family smiling proudly beside him. 2 years ago, I came home from war a broken man, Daniel began. I didn't know how to be a civilian again. Didn't know how to connect or belong. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have made it if not for Ranger here. He reached down to touch the dog's head, taking strength from the contact. Ranger saved my life in more ways than one. He gave me a purpose, a reason to keep going even when things seemed darkest. And in doing so, he showed me that I still had value. That I could still contribute. Daniel took a deep breath. With Ranger at my side, I found the courage to stand up to someone who thought his power and position made him untouchable. We all know how that turned out. A rumble of laughter and a few scattered cheers. The Langley scandal was still fresh in everyone's minds. But the point is, Ranger inspired me to fight. Not just for myself, but for my fellow veterans. For this town. And that's what I've tried to do since, with the Service Dog Initiative and the Community Center.